Romans 11:11-24, continues Paul's explanation of Israel's place in God's redemptive plan. Having established that Israel's widespread rejection of the Messiah did not mean God had abandoned his covenant purposes, Paul now explains how Israel's stumbling served a greater purpose in bringing salvation to the nations, while also provoking many Israelites to faith. This passage highlights God's sovereign wisdom, the inclusion of the Gentiles, and the unity of all believers in the one covenant people of God. Paul begins by asking whether Israel stumbled so as to fall beyond recovery. His answer is emphatic: certainly not. Israel's rejection of Christ was not the end of God's purpose for the nation. Instead, their stumbling became the means by which the gospel spread rapidly among the Gentiles. As the message moved beyond Israel, countless people from every nation received the righteousness that comes through faith. At the same time, this expansion of God's grace was intended to stir many Israelites to reconsider Jesus as the promised Messiah. Paul then magnifies his ministry among the Gentiles. Although he was an apostle to the nations, he never lost his desire to see his fellow Jews come to faith. He recognized that the proclamation of the gospel among the Gentiles demonstrated the fulfillment of God's promises and served as a testimony that the blessings promised to Abraham were now reaching all nations. Paul speaks of Israel's rejection bringing reconciliation to the world. This does not mean every individual was automatically reconciled, but that the barrier separating Jew and Gentile within God's covenant program had been removed through Christ. The message of reconciliation was now proclaimed freely without distinction. Israel's rejection of Jesus became the occasion through which salvation spread throughout the Roman Empire. The statement about Israel's acceptance being life from the dead points to the tremendous blessing that would accompany the gathering of believing Israelites into Christ during that generation. Throughout the book of Acts, many Jews believed the gospel, demonstrating that God continued calling his elect from among Israel until the close of the Old Covenant age. Paul next uses the illustration of firstfruits and the root. If the firstfruits are holy, the whole lump is holy. Likewise, if the root is holy, so are the branches. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were the root from whom God's covenant people sprang. God's promises given to them remained the foundation upon which his covenant purposes rested. The holiness described here refers to God's covenant setting apart of the people through his promises rather than to individual righteousness. Paul then introduces the illustration of the olive tree. Some natural branches were broken off because of unbelief, while wild olive branches, the Gentiles, were grafted into the cultivated tree. The olive tree represents the one covenant people of God that finds its fulfillment in Christ. There are not two separate peoples of God, but one people nourished from the same covenant root. The breaking off of natural branches was not based on ethnicity, but on unbelief. Likewise, the grafting in of Gentiles was not because of national superiority, but because they believed the gospel. Faith, not physical descent, determined participation in God's covenant blessings. Paul warns Gentile believers against arrogance. Since they did not support the root, but the root supported them, they had no reason for boasting. Everything they possessed came through God's gracious promises fulfilled in Christ. The history, covenants, and promises given through Israel formed the foundation upon which the gospel rested. The warning about continuing in God's goodness reminds Gentile believers not to become proud or presumptuous. Just as unbelieving Jews experienced covenant judgment through their rejection of Christ, Gentiles also were called to remain steadfast in faith rather than assuming privilege apart from trust in Christ. Paul emphasizes that God is able to graft the natural branches in again if they do not continue in unbelief. Throughout the apostolic age, this occurred repeatedly as thousands of Jews believed the gospel. God's desire was never the permanent exclusion of Israel, but the inclusion of all who believed his Son. The contrast between natural and wild branches illustrates God's extraordinary grace. If God could bring Gentiles into his covenant people, contrary to nature, he could certainly restore believing Jews who belonged naturally to the covenant promises given through their fathers. This entire section demonstrates that God's redemptive plan was never defeated by Israel's rejection of Jesus. Instead, their stumbling became the means through which the blessings promised to Abraham flowed to the nations, At the same time, God continued gathering a believing remnant from Israel until the completion of his covenant purposes. Romans 11:11-24 ultimately presents one redeemed people united in Christ. The dividing wall between Jew and Gentile had been removed. Unbelief excluded people from covenant participation regardless of ethnicity, and faith in Christ brought both Jews and Gentiles into the same olive tree. God's wisdom transformed Israel's stumbling into the very means by which his promises reached the world, displaying the riches of his grace and the certainty of his covenant faithfulness.